Hello everyone, welcome to MeroSiksha. I'm here with the another content today, and the content is relative clause. So you might have heard about this relative clause frequently, but still let us talk about this again today. So now, before getting into the relative clause itself, let me ask you a question regarding what is a clause. So before talking about this relative clause, you need to be much familiar with the idea of the clause itself. So what is clause? So yeah, let us find out what clause is. So clause is a group of words that contains a verb. So we don't have to think much about this. It's just a group of words along with a verb, and then it functions as a member of the complex sentence or the compound sentence. So we use clauses in order to create much longer or the larger sentences. So we do not usually use the clauses in order to make our sentence shorter, but rather if you are to create the compound and the complex sentences, we use clauses. For example, here I have written the example, and the example reads, I know how to drive a car, comma, but I enjoy riding bikes. So here we have two different sentences, and both the sentences are independent. So both the sentences have meaning on their own, but both the sentences has been joined with the conjunction but. And here we do not refer this but conjunction as the clause, but rather these sentences which are in bold are the clauses. And the clauses can either be dependent, also independent one. So the idea is a clause is just a group of words that contains a verb, and it can either be independent or dependent as well. So moving on to, let us talk about a relative clause now. So what is relative clause then? So as we already know that our clause contains a verb in itself, so relative clause tells us more about the people or a thing in a sentence. We use relative clause when we are to provide information regarding the people or a thing that appears in a sentence. So relative clause can be also understood as one kind of a dependent clause. Why do we call this relative clause as a kind of a dependent clause? Because here this relative clause can't stand alone when it has to provide meaning to us. It needs the support of the relative pronoun in a sentence to provide the ideas regarding what we are talking about. Similarly, this relative clause contains subject and a verb, but as they can't stand alone, it needs relative pronoun. And we can also call this relative clause as an adjective clause as well, because the function that it does in a sentence is quite similar to that of an adjective. That is, so what is the use of an adjective in a sentence? So what does the adjective do? So yeah, the adjective provides us more information about a noun or a pronoun in a sentence. So as relative clauses also provide much more information about noun or the pronoun in a sentence, we can call this relative clause as also an adjective clause. So moreover, a relative clause always begins with a relative pronoun. As I already mentioned before, relative clause can't stand alone because this is one kind of a dependent clause. It always needs relative pronoun in order to provide us the clear meaning. So which substitutes? So with the presence of the relative pronoun, we are presented much more information about either the noun or the noun phrase or the pronoun in order to make the sentence complete and or help the sentence provide the authentic meaning. So now moving on to, let us talk more about what are the relative pronouns. So what are those relative pronouns which help us to justify the relative clauses then? So here those relative pronouns are like who, whom, whose, which, that, and with the use of relative pronouns we introduce relative clauses. So in this sense it is dependent. So in order to present the idea of what we are talking about, we need relative pronoun. So the idea is relative clauses tells us about a person or a thing, or it talks about the noun. It also functions as an adjective clause, but in order to function it as an adjective clause, it needs the presence of the relative pronoun. So for example, I have written over here that she is the girl who has long brown hair over here. So if we fragment this particular sentence, we can create two independent sentences. That is, she is a girl and she has long brown hair. But in order to connect that particular two independent clauses, I have used over here relative pronoun who and connected the sentence, right? So here who is the relative pronoun which is providing us much more information about this girl, which is noun, and is telling us that the girl has a long brown hair. So moreover, to talk about more of the relative clause can be divided into two different types. So they are restrictive and non-restrictive. So these terminology might be quite different for you, but we have another idea as well in order to talk about what are the types of relative clause. So most of the people also introduce this restrictive and non-restrictive relative clause as a defining and the non-defining relative clause. Now let us find out what is restrictive relative clause, and then we will move to the non-restrictive relative clause. So can somebody tell me about what is restrictive relative clause? So what is the role of restrictive relative clause? So okay, let me tell you about it. So restrictive relative clauses provides information that defines noun. So it's quite simple that this relative clauses provides us information about noun and a pronoun. So in the same way, this restrictive relative clause also provides us the information about a noun, but it makes sure that the information is quite necessary. It just provides the essential information to us. So the information that's necessary in order to complete the proper identification of the noun. So that is, it provides us the information, but the information has to be essential. And then we do not use comma in order to identify that the particular sentence belongs to the category of restrictive relative clause. You can figure it out as you will not see any commas used over there. So moving on to the example. So here's the sentence that reads, I want to help those children. So in this particular sentence, the speaker I has mentioned us the idea that the I wants to help those children. But who are those children that the speaker I is talking about? So here the idea of the children or the noun that the I is talking about is unclear. We are not able to know who are those children that the speaker is talking about. So now we are not able to identify them. Therefore, now we are in need of the relative pronoun, and then with the help of the relative pronoun, you will be creating the relative clause over here. Now, here by adding the relative pronoun, we are able to present the much more information about the noun that the speaker I is referring to. So the speaker is referring to the idea that I want to help those children, whose is the relative pronoun, and then whose economic condition is very bad. So what is the thing that I is referring to over here? So I over here is talking about those children whose economic condition is very low. So now, this kind of information are those information which is helping us to know much more about the noun children over here. So until and unless this latter part of the sentence was over here, we are not able to know which those children were. So this is how restrictive relative clause works. Now let us move to the another idea and know about the non-restrictive relative clause. So what is non-restrictive relative clause, or also let us say non-defining relative clause? So this type of relative clause merely provides extra information. This also provides extra information, but the information can be important in order to know more about the noun, but the sentence is complete even though this particular information is not presented in a sentence. That is, but the information is not essential for the precise identification of the noun. We can identify a noun in a sentence, but the information might not be much more essential for us to make the sentence much more clear. And the next thing is, we don't use relative pronoun that. We cannot use relative pronoun that whenever we are writing or creating a sentence using non-restrictive relative clauses. So moreover, commas are always used at the beginning and end of these type of relative clauses. So in order to differentiate between restrictive and the non-restrictive one, you can differentiate it with the use of commas as well. That's the easiest method in order for you to differentiate that this sentence belongs to the category of restrictive and this one belongs to the category of non-restrictive one. For example, here I have a sentence. I have two sentences that is talking about my mother. It is providing us information about the mother. So the sentence reads, my mother is a farmer, or the another sentence reads, my mother grows a lot of vegetables. So my mother growing lot of vegetable, or the my mother is a farmer is providing us the insight, similar insight. We can either say that my mother grows a lot of vegetable, or we can just end it saying that my mother is a farmer, because the work of a farmer of course is to grow vegetables, right? So my mother is already clearly defined in this particular sentences. So then now as we are to provide the much more information again, or to add the information again, we use non-restrictive relative clause and then provide the meaning, and we use commas on the both side after using the clause. That is, this is how we write over here. So here my mother and then comma and then the relative pronoun, because we are talking about a my mother, which is referring to the idea of a person. We are talking about the person. So my mother who is a farmer, and then the comma again, and then we have adding the information that is grows a lot of vegetables. So this is how our non-restrictive clause is used. So we are supposed to use the relative clauses and the relative pronoun, but we are to differentiate it with the commas. So now let us talk about, so what are those relative pronouns and what those relative pronouns exactly stands for. So we use who relative pronoun to talk about the people, and this people indicates to the idea of the noun or a pronoun that is subject. We use who if we are talking about the noun or a pronoun that is subject, that is he, she, we, or they in the case of pronoun. And then moving on to the next, we use whom again for the people itself, but when we are to talk about the noun or a pronoun, and to be particular, when we are to talk about the pronoun that stands in a place of an object, then we use whom. And moving on to the whose, we use whose either to talk about people or the things, but here we use whose when we are to talk about something that reflects the idea of possession. That is, if you are talking about something that belongs to us, or something that indicates that we have a kind of we have a kind of impact into that particular thing or a person, then we'll be using whose in order to present the idea of possession. So moving on, we use that and which. So we use that and which both for the things. We can also use that for the people, but make sure that that can only be used whenever we are using it in a restrictive relative clause. So it can either be used as a subject or an object, but we are only supposed to use it in a restrictive relative clause form. So moving on, we use which. We use which to talk about the things when we have to refer to the things, but it can be used either as a subject or object, but it can also be used as in a non-restrictive relative clauses, and we can also use it in a restrictive one as well. And but usually people, they don't like using which whenever we are talking about the people or things, but we still use which. So I guess I made you guys clear. Thank you.